let's dive into the nativity story. This time we're uncovering hidden details and maybe even challenging what we think we know about the first Christmas. Especially like who is actually there. You sent over some really cool sources, including one document in Portuguese. And honestly, there's some pretty wild stuff in there.
It's crazy how much we think we know about this story. But when you really look, there's just so much we can keep exploring. Like take the Magi, for example. I mean, they're such a classic part of how we picture the nativity scene. But do we actually know anything about them?
Totally. I mean, we all have that picture in our heads, right? Those three guys on camels with all their gifts. But it turns out it's so much more interesting than that.
For sure. I mean, just think about it. Who are these guys? Traveling all the way from the east to find, like, a newborn king. And what kind of star led them on that crazy journey? These sources actually give us some pretty good clues.
Okay, so let's start by, setting the scene. This document, the one in Portuguese, really, paints a picture of that very first Christmas night. It's not just Mary and Joseph in a stable. There are shepherds there, kneeling, just in awe. There's this bright star in the sky. And there are even animals.
Right. And it's saying that this wasn't just some, average birth. The source really emphasizes this idea that, the scene, it's both earthly and celestial. So, it's pointing to how important this event really was.
It makes you wonder, right? Did people back then think those animals were symbolic too? Even though they're not actually mentioned in the Bible. But here's where it gets really interesting. The source. It actually points out who's missing from the nativity, from the traditional scene.
Yeah, it mentions how none of Jesus's family or friends were actually there, and maybe even more surprising, there weren't any religious leaders or political figures, which really changes how we usually picture things.
That's a really good point, because it shows that Jesus wasn't born into a rich, fancy family. It was humble beginnings.
Yeah, it's almost the opposite of what we expect.
Right.
When we think about kings, we think of them being born with all this wealth and fanfare, but Jesus's birth was, it was really understated. Which maybe shows us that his whole life was about to challenge, how things were usually done.
Okay, so we have to talk about the Magi, because honestly, they're the most fascinating part to me. The source makes it clear that they weren't there on the night Jesus was born, like we often imagine. They came later, when he was a child.
Right. It's also interesting, if you think about it, the Magi are only mentioned in Matthew. So in Matthew's gospel, but not Luke's. And it makes you wonder, why did Matthew even include them? What are they adding to his version of the story?
I never thought about it that way. What do you think about that?
Well, Matthew was writing for a Jewish audience, so maybe, the Magi, these mysterious figures coming from the east, maybe they represent the whole world, acknowledging how important Jesus was. It's like Matthew is saying, hey, even people outside Judaism, they get it. They recognize Jesus as the Messiah.
Oh, okay. That makes a lot of sense. It changes how we think about why they're even in the story. So let's unpack that a bit. Who were these Magi, really? The document says they came from the east, which isn't that helpful. It mentions Persia, Babylon, Arabia. These places were known for having ancient wisdom, and for understanding the stars.
Yeah, and we have to remember, back then the East was this mysterious, exotic place, at least to people in the Roman world. It was associated with magic and astrology and spiritual practices that were really different from their own.
Right, exactly. Like the word Magoi itself. The source points out it doesn't just mean wise men, it could also mean astrologers or sorcerers, or even priests from all these different Eastern religions.
Right, think about that word, Magoi. What images come to mind? Does it change how you picture them?
Totally. It makes them seem so much more mysterious, almost like figures straight out of a myth or a legend. It just adds to the whole mystery of the story. But okay, the biggest question, how did they even know about Jesus?
Right. So the source looks at Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, where it says that the Magi saw, quote, his star in the east. And that's where things get really interesting, because we have to consider that maybe, just maybe, the Magi actually knew about Jewish prophecies.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying they might have known about prophecies that said a Jewish king would be born?
It's totally possible, especially if they came from Babylon. There was a really big Jewish community there who had held on to their traditions and their scriptures.
So they could have known about the prophecy in Numbers, that one with the really strong image of a star out of Jacob.
Exactly. It's easy to see how they might connect a celestial event like a star with that prophecy.
Okay, that's amazing. But then it makes you wonder, Was it like a natural event they were just interpreting through that prophecy? Or was it some kind of divine sign specifically for them?
That's the question.
I'm hooked. And then there's the whole timing thing. The source mentions that Matthew doesn't say when the Magi saw the star.
Right. And remember, these guys traveled a long way. It wasn't like a quick trip from Persia or Babylon to Bethlehem. It could have taken them weeks, even months.
So they could have been following that star for like a long time, which means it might have shown up way before they even got to Bethlehem. Okay, so what does the source say about like when things happened?
Well, look at Herod. When the Magi showed up, Herod asked them about when they first saw the star. And then he ordered all the baby boys in Bethlehem, 2 years old and younger, be killed.
Wow. Okay, so the star could have appeared up to 2 years before they got to Bethlehem. That changes everything. I mean, about the timing we usually imagine.
Yeah, and it makes their whole mission a lot more urgent and dangerous, too. They weren't just on some leisurely trip. It was a race against time. And, you know, in the end, them showing up led to something awful. Those innocent children in Bethlehem.
That's hard to think about.
Yeah.
So after potentially years of traveling, following a star, the Magi finally get to Bethlehem, and then they give those famous gifts.
Right, the gifts, each one is so symbolic, and they weren't just random choices. The source goes into a lot of detail about their meaning.
Okay, yeah, let's get into that. What did each gift mean? And, like, how did those gifts show what the Magi thought about Jesus?
Okay, so gold first. I mean, gold wasn't just, valuable. It was like the symbol of a king, royalty, power, all that. Giving gold to Jesus, it was acknowledging him as a king.
Right, so from the very beginning, the Magi are seeing Jesus as, like, more than a regular baby.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. The source talks about how gold was seen in different cultures. Like in Persia, gold was connected to Mithra, the sun god.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that. So maybe by giving gold, the Magi were saying there was a connection between Jesus and this really powerful sun god.
Yeah, it's a really cool idea, right? It could mean they had like a more layered understanding of who Jesus was, one that fit with their own culture and religion. Then there's frankincense, which seems like a pretty weird gift for a baby.
Yeah, not exactly something you'd see on a baby shower gift list.
Right. But in ancient times, frankincense was super valuable. The source explains that it was burned as incense in, religious ceremonies. It was like a symbol of purity and divinity, that connection to like the spiritual world.
So it's like they were saying that they recognized Jesus as divine, as the Son of God, even though he was just a baby.
Exactly. And it's so interesting how these gifts, gifts they chose from their own traditions, line up perfectly with what Christians believe about Jesus. But then there's myrrh, and that one's a bit harder to understand.
Yeah, myrrh is always the one I've been confused about. Why give a newborn baby something that's associated with, death?
It's definitely a weird contrast. But remember, the Magi were probably really familiar with all those ancient prophecies, and some of those prophecies said the Messiah would suffer and die.
So maybe by offering myrrh, they were acknowledging that part of Jesus's destiny.
Yeah, that's one idea the source brings up, and it adds this layer of foreshadowing to the story. Even though everyone's celebrating Jesus' birth, there's also that acknowledgement that things will be difficult for him.
It's almost like they're saying, hey, we see you, Jesus, and we know who you really are. You're a king, you're God. And in the end, you're going to be a savior who suffers for everyone.
Exactly. They had a really complex understanding of Jesus. It shows how wise and insightful they were.
Okay, so we've talked about how the Magi were probably astronomers or astrologers or wise men following a star in ancient prophecies. But here's something I've been thinking about. If they had a star to guide them, what guides us today? I mean, we're living in a world with so much information and opinions and different ways of thinking. How do we even find our own way? Find what's true and what's meaningful?
Wow, that's a really great question. And honestly, I think we're all trying to figure that out in our own way. We're all on a journey, just like the Magi, searching for answers, trying to understand why we're here.
Yeah, but instead of a star in the sky, our stars are more abstract.
You got it. Think about it. What are the things that guide your life? Your values, your gut feelings, the people who've mentored you, the experiences that have challenged you. All of those things can be like stars. They light up your path.
I like that. It's like we each have our own compass inside us. But it's not always easy to listen to it, is it? There's so many things distracting us, so many voices trying to get our attention.
You're totally right. It's so easy to get lost.
So it's not about just blindly following something. It's about really looking at the world around us.
Yeah.
Being open to new ideas. But also thinking critically.
Exactly. And just like the Magi's journey had a lot of challenges and uncertainty, our own journeys will too.
But those challenges, that's how we learn, how we grow, how we figure out who we are and what really matters. This has been such a fascinating deep dive. We've gone way beyond the regular nativity story.
I know, right? It's amazing what you can find when you really look at a story, even a familiar one. The Magi are a perfect example. They're like a challenge to us, to question what we think we know, to look deeper, and to just embrace the mystery and wonder of this story.
I love that. Okay, before we move on, one more question. We've talked about what the gifts mean symbolically, but what about the actual gifts? What happened to them?
Oh, that's a good one. It's a question that scholars have been wondering about for centuries, and the Bible doesn't actually tell us what happened to them.
So it's still a mystery.
A total mystery. And maybe that's part of what makes this story so great. It gives us something to think about, like a puzzle to solve. And it lets us imagine all the possibilities.
I like that. It keeps the story going.
Yeah.
It invites us into the mystery. Okay, but I got to ask, does the source have any theories about what might have happened?
Yeah, actually it does. It mentions a few theories, ideas that people have had for a long time. One is that the gifts were used to help Jesus' family when they had to escape to Egypt.
Oh, that makes sense. I mean, imagine having to leave your home suddenly in the middle of the night
Yeah.
with a newborn baby.
Yeah.
You'd need money, right? And those gifts, they were worth a lot.
Yeah, totally. They could have sold the gold to pay for things or traded the frankincense and myrrh to get what they needed along the way. It's a really practical idea, and it fits with what was going on back then.
And it shows that those gifts weren't just symbolic. Like, they had a real purpose. They helped keep Jesus and his family safe.
Exactly. It's like, in this story, the divine and the human, they come together. But of course, there are other theories too. Some people think that the gifts were maybe lost or stolen at some point.
Yeah, you can imagine. Those gifts, they would have been tempting to steal, especially back then when traveling was so dangerous. And there were always people trying to take advantage.
For sure. I mean, there were no banks back then, no safe places to keep valuables. So keeping those gifts safe while they were traveling, it wouldn't have been easy.
So we don't know for sure what happened to them. It's just another part of the nativity story, full of mystery.
Right. It reminds us that even with the story everyone knows, there are still things we don't know, things lost to history, and questions that make us curious. Speaking of interesting details, though, there's something else we haven't talked about yet. The massacre of the innocents. It's a really dark part of the story, but it's important.
Right. It's where Herod ordered all the baby boys in Bethlehem to be killed. It's definitely a dark contrast to the joy and hope of Jesus being born.
Yeah. It reminds us that even when we're celebrating new life, there can still be darkness and violence. It makes us ask some tough questions about power and fear and how easily innocence can be hurt.
It makes you think about why Herod did it. Like, what made him do something so terrible?
Well, the source is that Herod was he was a really paranoid ruler and ruthless too. Anyone who might challenge him, he saw them as a threat. And he would get rid of them no matter what, even if it meant killing babies. So when the Magi showed up, saying there was a new king of the Jews, well, Herod must have been terrified.
Right, he was scared of losing his power.
Exactly, and that fear, it made him do something horrible. He thought it was better to kill all those babies than to risk losing control.
It shows how power can make people do awful things, and how fear can control even the most powerful people.
Yeah, it's like a warning about what happens when people only care about power. But there's also something ironic about it, right?
I think I see what you mean. By trying to kill Jesus, Herod actually made the prophecy come true.
You got it. The source says that Herod was actually part of God's plan. Even though he was trying to destroy Jesus, forcing Jesus' family to go to Egypt, well, it protected Jesus, and it set things up for him to come back later.
Wow, that's amazing when you think about it. Herod was trying to do something evil, but it ended up serving a bigger purpose.
Right. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when it seems like there's no hope, good can still win.
This deep dive has been like a roller coaster. We've talked about the joy and wonder of Jesus' birth, the mystery and wisdom of the Magi, and the terrible things that happened. It's amazing how one story can have so much in it.
It's because this story is so powerful, it still speaks to us. Even after all these years, it makes us think about faith and what it means to be human and how powerful hope can be.
I totally agree. I feel like I understand the nativity story in a whole new way now, and it's all because of the amazing sources you found.
And yours were great too. It's been fun exploring this with you. It just shows that there's always more to learn, even with stories we think we know.
Absolutely.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into the Nativity story. We hope you enjoyed it. And remember, keep searching for truth and meaning. Keep asking questions and let your own stars guide you. Until next time.